I got hired as a night security guard at a remote cabin resort in the Cascade Mountains in the fall of 2020. After the pandemic left me struggling to find work, I took the position, hoping the isolation would be peaceful, even though it wasn't ideal. The resort was spread across 500 acres of thick forest, with a dozen cabins and a main lodge where guests could check in or eat. My job was simple: patrol the area, keep everything locked up, and report any suspicious activity. It sounded easy enough. The manager, a middle-aged man named Greg, handed me a flashlight, a radio, and a key ring on my first night. "Nothing usually happens out here," he reassured me. "But if anything comes up, just call me or the local sheriff." I nodded, eager to get started. My schedule was from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. By the time my shift began, most guests had retreated to their cabins. My patrol route covered the lodge, the cabins, and a few trails that led into the woods. It was one of those places where the only noises you'd hear were the wind in the trees and the occasional owl hooting. The first few nights were quiet. I walked the same paths, shined my flashlight into the same dark corners, and locked the same doors. Occasionally, I heard strange sounds, branches breaking or soft rustling in the distance, but I attributed it to wildlife. Then, one night in late October, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the forest seemed unnervingly silent. I began my patrol as normal, checking the lodge first. It was empty, just as it should have been. I locked the doors and moved on to the cabins. As I approached cabin 6, I noticed the porch light was on. I distinctly remembered turning it off during my earlier rounds, so that struck me as strange. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking on the wooden planks, and peered through the window. The cabin seemed empty, but something felt wrong. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled musty, as if the place hadn't been aired out in weeks. The furniture was undisturbed, and the bed was neatly made. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there not long ago. I locked the door behind me and continued my rounds. The rest of the night passed quietly, but that unsettling feeling stuck with me. The next morning, I mentioned the light at cabin 6 to Greg. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a wiring issue. I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't convinced. A week later, things escalated. I was walking near the trailhead when I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. They led from the woods toward the cabins. I followed them for about 50 yards before they disappeared. The ground was too rocky to hold any more impressions. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but nothing seemed unusual. That night, I kept my hand on my radio, ready to call for backup at the slightest sign of trouble. Around 2 a.m., as I walked past cabin 8, I heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, like someone was lightly knocking on glass. My heart raced as I approached the cabin, but the tapping stopped as soon as I got closer. I circled the cabin, shining my flashlight on the windows and doors. Everything was locked, and the cabin appeared empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time my shift ended, I was on edge. I couldn't wait to leave and get back to my small apartment in town, away from the oppressive silence of the forest. But that uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next night, I brought my own flashlight, one I had bought, a heavy-duty model with a brighter beam than the one Greg had given me. As I walked my usual route, I felt a little more confident, but that confidence didn't last long. Around midnight, I noticed a flickering light in the woods. It wasn't a steady glow like a flashlight or lantern. It was more like a flame wavering in the dark. I hesitated, unsure whether to investigate. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and into the trees. The light seemed to move further away as I got closer, drawing me deeper into the forest. After about 10 minutes, I realized how far I had wandered from the main trail. I stopped, shining my flashlight in a wide arc. The flame was gone. That's when I heard it, low, guttural, like someone exhaling sharply. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't alone. Slowly, I backed away, keeping my flashlight trained on the area where I had seen the movement. The sound came again, closer this time. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the forest floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand, its beam lighting up a pair of boots standing just a few feet away. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it upward, but the figure was gone. My breathing was ragged as I backed toward the trail, half expecting to feel a hand grab me from behind. When I finally reached the cabins, I locked myself in the maintenance shed and stayed there until dawn. I didn't report what happened to Greg. What could I say? That I chased a flickering light into the woods and nearly had a heart attack? I didn't want to sound crazy. Over the next few nights, I stuck to the main paths, avoiding the forest entirely. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I began noticing small things. Doors I had locked were now open, objects moved from their usual places, faint footprints in the dirt. The final straw came on a freezing night in early November. I was patrolling near the lodge when I heard a sharp crack behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight revealed a man standing about 20 feet away. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and holding what looked like an axe. My blood froze as we locked eyes for a moment. Neither of us moved. Then he took a step toward me. I bolted. I didn't care about my duties or the property. I just ran. The sound of heavy footsteps followed me as I sprinted toward the parking lot. My truck was parked at the edge, and I fumbled with my keys as I reached it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My headlights illuminated the man standing at the edge of the lot, his axe gleaming in the light. He didn't chase me as I sped away, but the image of him standing there haunted me. I quit the next day. Greg seemed annoyed but didn't ask for details. I didn't explain myself. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still see his silhouette in my mind, standing silently in the dark, watching, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 25 years old. My dad's old friend, Mike, owned a cabin out in the remote forest of northern Wisconsin. He often talked about it, saying it was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Dad had been there a few times and always returned with stories of its peace and beauty. One weekend, Mike invited me to stay there for a few days. He couldn't make it, but said the cabin would be mine to enjoy, fully stocked and ready. It sounded perfect. I'd been feeling worn out from work, and the idea of being surrounded by nature seemed just what I needed. I packed lightly, clothes, a few books, and my hiking gear. Mike had given me detailed directions, since the cabin wasn't on any GPS. He warned me about the remoteness and told me there'd be no cell service, with the nearest neighbor being miles away. This didn't bother me at all. In fact, it made the trip sound even more inviting. The drive up was uneventful, but the farther I got from the city, the more I noticed how quiet it became. The sound of the highway faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird chirping. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, I hadn't seen another vehicle for almost an hour. The road was bumpy, with branches brushing against my car, making it feel like I was entering another world, far removed from the city I had left behind. When I arrived, the cabin was just as Mike had described, small but charming, with a wooden porch overlooking a small clearing. Beyond the clearing, the forest stretched out endlessly. Inside, the cabin was rustic but clean. It had a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a bedroom at the back. On the wall hung a couple of old hunting rifles, and a stack of firewood was neatly arranged by the door. Mike had left a note on the kitchen counter, welcoming me and reminding me to lock the doors at night. I didn't think much of it at the time. That first day was exactly what I needed. I spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin, following a narrow trail that led to a small, crystal-clear lake. The water was so still it mirrored the sky perfectly. I sat by the shore for a while, soaking in the tranquility of the place. There was a peace to it that I hadn't felt in years. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. I built a fire, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in with one of my books. The night was unnervingly quiet. I had always thought forests were noisy places, full of chirping crickets and hooting owls, but here, there was nothing. It was so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat. The only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. I attributed it to the isolation and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It felt irrational, but I still double-checked that the doors were locked before going to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, it was faint, like the crunching of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to listen. Then I heard it again, closer this time. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it, a low, deliberate scraping sound, like metal dragging across wood. My heart pounded. I quietly got out of bed and crept to the living room. The fire had almost gone out, and the cabin was nearly dark. I grabbed one of the rifles from the wall, even though I had no idea how to use it. My hands trembled as I approached the window and peeked out. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The forest beyond was a solid wall of darkness. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting for the sound to come again, but it didn't. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe a dream or just the strange noises of the forest playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking and tried to shake off the unease, but as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't relax, not even with the fire roaring and a book in hand. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and I found myself checking the windows more than once. That night, the noises came again, louder and more deliberate this time. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow and heavy, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were there. The scraping sound returned, sharper than before. This time, it was coming from the front porch. My heart raced as I crept toward the door, rifle in hand. I didn't open the door, but I peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The rest of the night is a blur. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from my spot by the door. The footsteps came and went, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but they never left the clearing. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed my things quickly and headed to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest felt different in the daylight, less peaceful, more oppressive. When I reached my car, I saw deep, jagged scratches on the driver's side door, marks that no animal could have made. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever had been outside the cabin had been so close to me, separated only by the thin walls of the cabin. I didn't look back as I drove away, my tires kicking up dust on the narrow dirt road. The cabin disappeared from my rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. I never told Mike what happened, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those footsteps and the scratches on my car. I wonder who or what was out there in the woods watching me, and I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next visitor to the cabin, thinking they're alone. On a cold, rainy night in late October, the kind that made you regret choosing night shifts, the rain had been coming down heavily for hours, soaking everything in its path and turning the dirt roads into mud-filled streams. I had just started my shift as a deputy for the county sheriff's office in a small town hidden in the foothills of the northern part of the state. Nights like this were usually quiet, sometimes too quiet, but something about this night felt off from the start. The first few hours seemed to drag on. My patrol car's wipers squeaked as they struggled to clear the windshield, barely keeping up with the relentless downpour. I checked the usual spots: empty highways, deserted parking lots, and the occasional side road where teenagers often gathered. There was nothing. The radio buzzed with static, interrupted now and then by dispatches for minor calls. It seemed like another slow, uneventful night. Around midnight, I decided to head out to the edge of our jurisdiction, where an old logging road snaked through thick woods. It was an area that hardly ever saw any action, but it was part of my duties to patrol it. The road was little more than a dirt path winding through towering pines and dense underbrush. The farther I drove, the more the town's lights faded until all I had was the dim glow of my headlights piercing through the dark. About a mile in, I saw it. A dilapidated cabin barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was set back from the road, partly concealed by trees and thick brush. I recognized it. It had been abandoned for years, a relic from when loggers used to live out here, closer to their work. The people in town avoided it, saying it was dangerous, but out of curiosity or maybe boredom, I decided to stop. I parked my cruiser at the edge of the gravel driveway and left the engine running. Up close, the cabin looked even worse. The roof sagged in places, the windows were shattered, and the front porch looked ready to collapse. But then something caught my eye, a faint flickering light inside. It wasn't much, just a dim glow barely visible through the cracks in the weathered wood. But it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The rain immediately soaked through my jacket, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decaying wood. As I walked toward the cabin, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud leading to the front. Someone had been here recently. My instincts screamed at me to call it in, but I hesitated. It didn't feel like an emergency, just someone seeking shelter from the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I pushed open the creaky door, which groaned on its hinges, and shined my flashlight inside. The interior was as run down as the outside. The floorboards were warped, and the room was cluttered with debris. The walls bore the marks of years of neglect. The faint light I had seen was coming from a single candle, sitting on a wooden table in the center of the room. Around the table, there were signs of recent activity: an open backpack, a half-drunk water bottle, and a pile of blankets. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about the scene didn't sit right. Why would someone leave their things behind in the middle of a storm? My flashlight caught something tucked into the corner of the room: a bundle of rope and what looked like a tarp. My stomach turned. The rain hammered against the roof as I stepped further into the cabin. My boots creaked as I moved across the floor. The cabin was small, just a single room with a loft above. I climbed up the narrow ladder to check the loft. It was empty except for a rotted mattress and a pile of old newspapers. When I came back down, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a door, partially hidden behind a curtain. It was slightly ajar, leading down what looked like a basement. I didn't want to go down there, but I couldn't ignore it. I pushed the door open, revealing a steep staircase that led into the darkness. The air down there was damp and heavy, with a faint metallic smell that I couldn't quite place. My flashlight flickered as I descended the stairs, my heart pounding. The basement was cold and unfinished. The floor was dirt, and the walls were stone. My flashlight beam landed on a large wooden crate near the far wall, partially open. Inside were tools, but not the usual tools you'd expect to find in an old cabin. There were bolt cutters, duct tape, and a hacksaw, all neatly arranged. Next to the crate were a pair of muddy boots and a coat that didn't look old or abandoned. That's when I heard it, something from above. The faint creak, like a floorboard shifting. My blood ran cold. Someone was upstairs. I turned off my flashlight and drew my weapon, moving as quietly as I could back up the stairs. The house was silent, but I could feel the presence of someone just out of sight. My mind raced with possibilities. Whoever it was must have come back while I was in the basement, and they hadn't made a sound. I crept toward the front door, but before I could reach it, I saw a figure dart past the window, heading toward my patrol car. I ran outside, slipping in the mud as I went. The rain was coming down even harder, making it almost impossible to see. By the time I reached the driveway, the figure was gone, but my cruiser's driver's side door was wide open. The keys were still in the ignition, but the radio was dead, its wires cut cleanly. Whoever this person was, they had planned for this. I stood there, exposed, in the pouring rain with no way to call for help. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just the sound of rain and my ragged breath. I knew it was time to go. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than me. Without communication, I was vulnerable. I got into the car and started the engine, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror as I backed out of the driveway. The road was slick, and my tires struggled for traction as I sped away from the cabin. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch seemed to reach out. I drove faster than I should have, desperate to get back to town. After about a mile, I noticed something strange. The same tire tracks I'd seen at the cabin were now on the road ahead of me, leading in the same direction I was going. Panic surged in my chest. Someone was ahead of me, driving away from the cabin, but I hadn't seen any other vehicles. My stomach dropped as I rounded a bend and saw a truck parked in the middle of the road. The headlights were off, and the driver's side door was open, but there was no one inside. I stopped the car, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't want to get out, but I couldn't just stay there. I stepped into the rain, my weapon drawn, and approached the truck. The interior was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, and a fresh set of muddy footprints led away from the vehicle and into the woods. I followed the tracks for a few steps before I stopped. Something was wrong. The footprints were uneven, like whoever had made them was either injured or carrying something heavy. I turned back toward my car, but before I could take another step, I heard something behind me. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl. I whipped my flashlight around, sweeping the trees, but there was nothing. My heart was racing, and every instinct told me to run. Without a second thought, I sprinted back to my car and drove off as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of the station. The rest of the night was a blur. I filed my report, leaving out some of the weirder details, and handed it over to the sheriff. He nodded but didn't say much. I could tell he didn't believe me, but I know what I saw, or rather what I felt. That cabin wasn't just an abandoned relic from the past. Someone or something was out there watching, waiting, and I wasn't about to go back to find out what it was. My gym buddy Mark always seemed like someone who had his life perfectly figured out. He was in his early 40s, always sharply dressed, and a thriving entrepreneur who could handle himself both in a business meeting and at the squat rack. Meanwhile, I worked a straightforward office job, living a simple routine. Mark's life appeared almost unreachable: luxury cars, custom suits, and vacations to places I'd only seen on postcards. We worked out together almost daily, and over time we grew closer. One evening, after a particularly grueling leg day, Mark mentioned that he owned a cabin about 3 hours west of the city. It was his getaway, a sanctuary to escape the stress of his hectic lifestyle. He suggested we take a weekend trip there to relax, fish, and leave the noise of city life behind. At first, I hesitated. Spending time in a secluded cabin wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but Mark was persuasive. I eventually agreed, figuring it might be a refreshing change from my usual routine. We planned the trip for late October, just as the weather was beginning to cool and the forest was alive with autumn colors. Mark picked me up early on a crisp Saturday morning in his sleek, navy blue SUV, and we hit the road. The drive began on smooth highways but soon turned into winding country roads. Thick trees lined the gravel path, their branches forming a canopy above us. "Almost there," Mark said as the vehicle bumped over a pothole. Eventually, we arrived at a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch. The wood looked aged but sturdy, and the windows mirrored the forest around it. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp leaves. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly tidy. The main floor featured a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a compact kitchen, and a dining nook. Upstairs were 2 small bedrooms. Old hunting photos and hand-drawn maps adorned the walls, giving the space a rustic charm. "This is where I come to clear my mind," Mark said, tossing his bag onto the couch. We spent the first few hours unpacking and getting comfortable. Mark had brought steaks, beer, and even a portable speaker for music. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, the fireplace was crackling, and the aroma of grilled food filled the cabin. As the evening wore on, the isolation of the place started to sink in. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town, with no cell service and only the faint rustle of the forest to accompany us. Mark seemed perfectly at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being utterly cut off. That night, sleep eluded me. The bed was comfortable enough, but the silence was overwhelming. Every creak of the wooden walls and every whisper of wind outside felt amplified. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps on the porch. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, Mark suggested a hike. There was a trail about half a mile from the cabin that led to a scenic overlook. We packed some snacks and water and set off. The trail wound through dense underbrush, with sunlight filtering through the trees in golden patches. Halfway through, we stumbled upon a clearing with an old, crumbling structure, a small, weathered shed. Its roof was caving in, and the wood was dark with age. "Never noticed this before," Mark murmured, stepping closer to inspect it. Something about the shed gave me an uneasy feeling. The surrounding area seemed oddly clear of fallen branches and leaves, as if someone had been keeping it tidy. "Let's keep moving," I suggested, eager to leave it behind. We eventually reached the overlook. The view was stunning. Rolling hills blanketed in fiery shades of orange and red stretched as far as the horizon. We sat on a rock, eating in quiet appreciation of the scenery. On our way back, we passed the shed again. This time, I noticed a faint trail leading from the back of it, deeper into the woods. It was barely noticeable, just a strip of flattened grass. "Probably a game trail," Mark said when I pointed it out. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere felt different. I couldn't pinpoint why, but the air seemed heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker. I chalked it up to my imagination and focused on helping Mark prepare dinner. That night, the footsteps returned. They were faint but deliberate, moving across the porch. My pulse quickened as I froze, straining to listen. Then, just as abruptly as they began, they stopped. I debated waking Mark, but decided against it. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but nothing was there. The next morning, we visited a nearby lake. We spent the day fishing and lounging by the water, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but every time I looked, there was nothing. As we packed up to leave, I spotted something on the far side of the lake, a figure standing at the water's edge. It was too far to make out details, but it was unmistakably human. "Do you see that?" I asked Mark, pointing toward it. When he turned to look, the figure was gone. Back at the cabin, I finally told Mark about the footsteps I'd heard. He laughed it off, saying it was probably animals, but I could see a flicker of unease in his expression. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. I heard them circle the cabin, the sound of gravel crunching under deliberate steps. Mark grabbed his flashlight and checked outside. "Nothing there," he said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The next morning, we decided to leave early. As we loaded the SUV, I noticed footprints in the dirt beneath my bedroom window. Large, unmistakably human prints. Neither of us said a word as we drove away, the weight of unspoken fear thick in the air. As we merged onto the main road, I glanced back. The cabin stood silently among the trees, but I thought I saw a shadow move across the porch. Mark never mentioned the trip again, and neither did I. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I never plan to. It was late spring, and I had just turned 29 when my cousin invited me to spend a week at her cabin. She had mentioned it a few times before, but my schedule had never allowed it. My cousin, a determined and accomplished woman, worked as a senior manager at a large financial firm. She'd carved out a comfortable life for herself, and the cabin served as her refuge from the pressures of her demanding job. Her supervisor, Mr. Davis, occasionally used the cabin for corporate getaways. This time, he planned to join her for some fishing and to discuss work. The cabin was tucked away in a dense forest near a secluded lake in Wisconsin. It was the kind of place where cell service was practically non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Although the thought of being disconnected didn't thrill me, the promise of a quiet week after a stressful period at work was appealing. I arrived on a Tuesday morning to find my cousin unpacking groceries in the cozy kitchen. She greeted me warmly, but I could see traces of exhaustion in her expression, likely from her high-pressure career. Mr. Davis wasn't due until that evening, so we spent the day tidying up the cabin and catching up. The small cabin had 2 bedrooms, a snug living area, and a screened porch overlooking the lake. When Mr. Davis finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting golden light over the water. Mr. Davis was a tall man in his early 50s with an air of authority. I hadn't met him before, but my cousin had described him as both demanding and reasonable. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a fishing pole in the other, a curious combination. The first 2 days were uneventful. My cousin and Mr. Davis spent most of their time on the porch, discussing work, while I wandered through the forest trails or read by the lake. The tranquility was refreshing, though an inexplicable sense of unease hovered in the background. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle tension that crept in during moments of silence. On the 3rd evening, we decided to have a cookout. The cool night air carried the scent of grilled burgers, and the crackling fire provided warmth. The starry sky was a rare sight for someone used to city life. It should have been a perfect night, but the unease lingered. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, and the shadows from the firelight stretched out too far. When I mentioned this to my cousin, she gave me a peculiar look and said, "These woods have their quirks. You'll adjust." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. That night, I woke to a faint noise, something like creaking wood or leaves rustling. It was subtle but unsettling enough to jolt me awake. I lay still, listening. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional groan of its aging structure. Convincing myself it was nothing, I eventually drifted back to sleep, though the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest despite my cousin's warnings not to stray too far. Curiosity got the better of me. Following a narrow trail, I found myself in a clearing with an old, decaying shed. The walls were cloaked in moss, and part of the roof had collapsed. It looked abandoned for decades, and it wasn't marked on any maps at the cabin. As I approached, the warm spring air felt noticeably cooler. Peering through the broken window, I saw the interior was nearly empty, save for a rusted metal cot and a stack of yellowed newspapers. The date on one read 1981. A sharp crack behind me made me whirl around, but no one was there. The stillness of the woods was unsettling, and I hurried back to the cabin. That evening, I mentioned the shed to my cousin. Her face paled, and she exchanged an uneasy glance with Mr. Davis. "You shouldn't wander off like that," she said firmly. "These woods aren't as empty as they seem." She refused to elaborate, and Mr. Davis seemed unusually quiet for the rest of the night. The following night, faint noises woke me again, this time louder, like footsteps on the porch. My pulse quickened as I listened. The footsteps stopped, followed by the groan of the porch swing. Gathering my courage, I peered out the window to see the swing swaying gently in the breeze, empty. The next morning, Mr. Davis announced he would stay behind to work while my cousin and I went hiking. She was unusually quiet during our walk. When I asked about the shed, she reluctantly admitted that the woods had a dark history. Decades ago, people had disappeared in the area, and the mysteries were never solved. The shed, she speculated, might have been part of an old logging operation. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun had set, but Mr. Davis was gone. His belongings remained, but there was no sign of him. Alarmed, we searched the surrounding area with flashlights, but found nothing. Exhausted, we called the authorities the next day. A search team scoured the forest for days but uncovered no clues. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Weeks after returning home, I couldn't shake the experience. I researched the area and discovered an article about disappearances near an old shed in the woods. The description matched the one I had found. I haven't returned to the cabin since. My cousin sold it shortly after, saying she couldn't bear to keep it. I don't blame her. Something about those woods felt wrong, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what might still be lurking out there, waiting for its next visitor. It was 2012, and my partner Lisa convinced me to spend a week at her late grandmother's secluded cottage deep in the Canadian wilderness. I'd never been there, but Lisa had spent many childhood summers at the place. She recalled it fondly. Swimming in the river, hiking through dense pine forests, and sitting by the fire during cool evenings. For me, it was an opportunity to escape the city, unplug, and relax. The cottage itself was a simple wooden structure built in the 1960s by Lisa's late grandfather. It stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever. We drove out in my aging SUV, bumping over potholes and dodging low-hanging branches. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, and the shadows of the towering trees stretched long across the clearing. The air smelled of pine and dry earth, a scent unfamiliar to me. The cottage was exactly as Lisa had described it. Weathered wooden walls, a tin roof that looked like it could barely withstand a storm, and a small front porch with a rocking chair that creaked even when untouched. Inside, the space was basic but functional. A tiny kitchen with an old wood stove, a modest living area with mismatched furniture, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed frame. A back door led to an outhouse just a short walk away. Rustic, to say the least, but it had a certain charm. Our first night was uneventful. We prepared a simple meal, lit a fire, and sat outside under the vast, starry sky. The silence of the forest was both soothing and disconcerting. In the city, there's always some background noise, but here, it was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. The next day, we explored the area. There was a partially overgrown path leading to a river about half a kilometer from the cottage. The water was icy but crystal clear. Lisa waded in while I skipped stones. The forest was thick, with towering trees, tangled underbrush, and dry patches of grass. It was beautiful, but I couldn't ignore how isolated it felt. The dense trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight in some spots. By the third day, I began to feel uneasy. At first, it was subtle, a vague sense that we weren't entirely alone. I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, I wasn't accustomed to being so far removed from civilization. That afternoon, while Lisa napped, I decided to chop some wood for the fireplace. The axe was old but sharp enough, and there was a stack of logs near the shed. As I worked, I kept hearing faint rustling sounds from the woods. Each time I paused to listen, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered. Later that evening, as the sun set, we heard an unusual noise, a low, guttural growl coming from the direction of the river. Lisa thought it might be a coyote or a stray dog, but I wasn't so sure. Whatever it was, it sounded large. We decided to stay inside for the night. I bolted the door and double-checked the windows. The forest came alive after dark with sounds of insects, distant animal calls, and occasional rustling nearby. Around midnight, I woke to a faint scraping noise against the cottage walls. It started softly but grew louder. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The sound moved slowly around the cottage, deliberate, as if circling us. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, shining the beam outside, but saw nothing. The scraping stopped as soon as the light hit the walls. The next morning, I searched the perimeter but found no footprints or claw marks. Lisa laughed it off, suggesting it might have been a raccoon. I nodded but couldn't shake my unease. On the fifth day, we ventured deeper into the forest, following an old trail Lisa remembered from childhood. The path was overgrown and hard to navigate, but we pressed on. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a peculiar clearing. At its center was a circle of stones arranged unnaturally. The rocks were scorched, as though from a fire, but it didn't look recent. Scattered among the stones were shards of glass and charred wood. Lisa seemed unsettled, saying she didn't recall this spot. We decided to head back. As we walked, that eerie sense of being watched returned. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. That night, the noises intensified. Scraping gave way to heavy thuds against the walls and faint, chilling whispers that seemed to come from all around us. I didn't sleep at all. By the sixth day, I was ready to leave, but Lisa wanted to stay. She didn't want her cherished childhood memories overshadowed by a few strange occurrences. Reluctantly, I agreed. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed something metallic glinting just beyond the trees. When we went to investigate, it was gone. Back at the cottage, the tension was palpable. We ate dinner in near silence, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back. Late that night, the front door rattled violently. Someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed the axe and stood frozen, listening. The rattling stopped, but a loud bang followed, as though something heavy had been thrown against the door. I shouted, hoping to scare off whatever was out there, but there was no response. Only silence, then the whispers again, low and guttural, surrounding us. As soon as dawn broke, we packed our things and left. The drive back to the city was silent, both of us too shaken to speak. I don't know what we encountered in that cottage, but I'm certain of one thing. Something didn't want us there, and I won't ever go back.